Bede, some use the argument from the existence of consciousness, which today is really a hot topic among scientists, philosophers, to infer an existence of God. And I'm fascinated by this. It was my old field was brain science as a student, and I've been fascinated with consciousness my whole life. So I'm intrigued by these kinds of argument, that there's something special about consciousness, and that leads you to believe that there is an ultimate consciousness. What do you make of that argument?
I think there is something special about consciousness, certainly, but whether or not it has any supernatural implications is another matter. Let me just say a few words more generally about consciousness. People often think that this is the last great problem to solve. What is the nature of consciousness? And it appears to them as a problem because they implicitly take consciousness to be like some kind of stuff, but not this coarse stuff that our arms and legs are made of, some more ethereal, subtle substance. And the question is, how does that substance relate to the brain, say, and the physical more generally? Now, it's a rather dry approach, but I think it's worth looking at the term consciousness in the category of different kinds of noun. And here you say, well, it's an abstract noun. It's like kindness, for example, or carelessness. And you note with them that when you use one of them, you could equally use just the adjective. So if you say her kindness was overwhelming, you can equally say she was overwhelmingly kind. It's just a stylistic variant. And you wouldn't think of kindness as some kind of stuff. You say there's no more implication of that than there is with the one using just the adjective. Now, take consciousness. To lose consciousness is just to cease to be conscious. It's not some stuff that's suddenly vanished. Well, what is it? Well, it's in the same category of terms such as being aware, being attentive, being alert. And whether or not a creature is conscious, going through that range of things, it's pretty easy to determine. So you know that the lion chasing you is conscious. For unfortunately, he shows his awareness of his environment by modifying what he does in the pursuit of you. So there's no doubt about it in your mind. And you didn't have to speculate about some strange substance or some strange anything going on in mind or brain. The consciousness is manifested in a certain kind of purposeful behavior. All right. Now, that's by way of indicating that it is a natural phenomenon. You can think of how creatures evolved in such a way that they had very primitive senses, which then developed into rather more complex ones, indeed with some animals much more complex than what we have by way of eyes and ears and so forth. And if that is right, then it's just, again, a matter of detail, fleshing out, well, two things: the nature of it, what this particular virtue is, and then trying to see how we could have come to be conscious. Now, I think some people would say there's something missing there, because in the sense of conscious I've been using, an animal can be conscious. The opposite of that is being unconscious, fast asleep or something like that. But can't we be conscious in a much higher way? So usually what is meant is something like, not only can I see, but I can be aware that I see. I can reflect on my seeing.
Self-awareness.
Self-awareness. So, all right, what do we do with that one? Well, again, it's now going to be pretty well purely philosophical, I suspect, because you've got to try and tease out just what is peculiar to that form of consciousness. And one way of going about that is by saying, well, could an animal be self-conscious? And that leads you on to saying, well, you need thought because you're thinking about what you're seeing, say. Can you have thought without language? And so there's a whole cluster of topics here which are very interesting indeed. And I have the following general reflection. I don't like isms. You have something here which is just an intellectual challenge. Forget about someone being a Cartesian or a physicalist or whatever. Just look at it in its own right and see what progress you can make.
Yeah. So let's do that, because some people, even physicists, would say that consciousness is something that's the most fundamental thing in the universe. People who don't even believe in God, when you push them far enough and say, okay, how do you imagine the cosmology or the fundamental physics? No God, fine. At the end of the day, some of them, not all, some of them will say there's some kind of consciousness. So consciousness is something that really pervades a lot of intellectual thinking about the nature of reality.
And do they think that the fact that cats and dogs can be conscious suggests anything supernatural?
Some would just have consciousness be something fundamental in the universe.
Yes.
Others would use consciousness as an inference to God. So there's all different uses of it now.
And I come back to the first point, that it's easy to make more of a problem than there is if you think of consciousness as some kind of stuff with a location. See, so you probably remember neuroscientists saying things like, I've looked into many brains, but I've never found a thought, I've never found consciousness. But the brain isn't conscious, it's the person who's conscious, and the person shows his being conscious in a variety of very familiar ways. I mean, it's quite evident to you that I'm conscious. And what you've got to do is to try and spell out in greater detail what it is you go by in reaching that conclusion, and then ask yourself, well, does this make any demands on anything outside the natural world? And I just don't see that it does. I mean, it's terribly important. It's still mysterious, but then we've had lots of mysteries to cope with, and by and large, they give way to a combination of thought and experiment.